Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are today. It is February 6, 2025, and we want to welcome you to our third webinar in this series focused on history of people, forests, and forestry. This series is co-hosted by the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment and the Forest History Society. My name is Tanya Muntz, and I am the president and CEO of the Forest History Society based in Durham, North Carolina in the US. And I am one of your hosts of this series and will be introducing today's webinar. And now let me introduce my co-hosts for this History of People, Forests, and Forestry series. First, in the middle, you see Professor Mark Ashton. Mark is the Morris K. Jessup Professor of Silviculture and Forest Ecology and the Director of the Yale Forests. Our other co-host on the right is Gary Dunning, and Gary is the Executive Director of the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment, based in New Haven, Connecticut in the US. And Gary and I are going to be trading off facilitating duties for this series. Let me tell you a bit more about the series. As you know, this YFF webinar series will explore histories of people, forests, and forestry. And you can see on this slide the fantastic slate of speakers and themes that we've lined up for you over the next 4 months. We're still filling in a few of the speaker slots, so please stay tuned for further news on that. And just a couple of logistical reminders about our series. The series is going to be convening on Thursdays from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern US time through the end of April. The webinar presentations will run roughly 30 minutes, and then we have audience Q&A to follow. Please remember to submit any questions you might have using the Zoom's Q&A function, and then the session in the series will also be recorded and available on the Yale Forest Forum's website shortly after the session. If you have any questions related to the series, please email us, and that email address is yff@yale.edu. All right, now I am very delighted to introduce today's speaker, Eduardo Neves. Eduardo is a professor of archaeology at the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at the University of São Paulo, Brazil. And he has been conducting archaeological research in the Amazon since the late 1980s and is also the head of the National Geographic-funded project Amazon Revealed. That project is LiDAR mapping large areas of the Brazilian Amazon to identify archaeological sites in threatened areas. Eduardo's talk today is entitled The Role of Indigenous Peoples in Creating the Amazonian Forests. Eduardo, thank you so much for joining us, and now it's my pleasure to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Can you hear me well? Well, thank you, Gary, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here and talk with you. Just before I jump in my presentation, as you just said, Tanya, I'm an archaeologist, but I'll be showing many pictures of trees and gardens because when I'm doing field work in the Amazon, as much as paying attention to the things that I see under the ground during the excavations, I like just to check the surrounding areas, the forests, and the gardens in the places where I work. Let me just jump into my presentation so we can, hold on. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you see it? Is everything okay?
Yes, we can see it.
All right. So I'll start with this paper, which was published in 2013. Probably most of you are aware of it, which had a major impact on us working in the Amazon. That's based on a tree inventory done by several authors over the decades. And everything that you see here, and maybe some of you are co-authors of this article, some of the dots that you see in this map are places where those tree inventories have been made in the Amazon basin. And one interesting conclusion of this paper is that the authors estimated that there should be around 390 billion trees in the Amazon, grouped into 16,000 tree species. But then comes the interesting thing for us archaeologists, is that only 227 of those 16,000 species account for almost half of all tree species in the Amazon. In other words, there's lots of diversity, many tree species, many trees, but a very small amount of them account for very large amounts of frequency in the record. And the authors call this hyperdominance. We know today that this pattern is not found only in the Amazon, but also in other tropical forests of the world. What's interesting about this is that if you look at the list of the 10 most abundant trees in the Amazon, we're going to see that some of them, or most of them, are palm trees. And the most common tree in the Amazon, for instance, is the açaí palm, or açaí do mato in Portuguese, Euterpe precatória. But it's interesting to check this list because we see that most of those trees, I mean, they're very important economically and symbolically for the indigenous people of the Amazon today. And as I'm going to tell you in a few moments, we also find evidence of some of those plants in the archaeological record of the area. That for those of you who are not familiar with tropical rainforests, that's, for instance, a house, it's a village. It's like, you can say like it's a garden village in the midst of an açaí grove in a place in the Rio Negro Basin in the central Amazon in Brazil. Some of the slides are in Portuguese, and I apologize for this. Another example, that's also like an açaí. This looks like, for people who are not familiar to a place like that, it looks like an abandoned plot. But actually what we see there, we have a garden here, an old garden where people used to grow manioc. But we have papaya trees in the front. We have the peach palm here, the açaí palm. We have lemon trees as well, growing banana trees, growing on the top of an archaeological site with dark soils. I'm going to be talking a little bit about those dark soils in a moment, but these are anthropic soils created by indigenous people in the past. So, I mean, that's an interesting thing here. I mean, again, I'm not a forester, but we see here a very interesting, as I may say, forest in a stage of succession, which is dominated by useful, economically, symbolically important trees for the people. Some of them are exotic, like the lime trees, but some of them are local traditional cultivars, such as the açaí palm. After that paper was published, the one about hyperdominance, my colleague Carolina Neves and other people as well, and actually a co-author of this paper, we published this in 2017. I'm just trying to move here because I can't read the things that I want to tell you. Oh, yes. We just published this. Just give me 1 second. Bear with me. I mean, we're in this paper that we showed that I'm going to talk about domestication in a moment as well. But we basically pointed that there's a very strong correlation between hyperdominant tree species and domesticated species in the Amazon. In other words, that pattern that we see today, we may say this botanical pattern, this pattern of tree coverage of the Amazon, is probably highly influenced by indigenous management over the millennium, and we can see that in the record of hyperdominant species in contemporary Amazonia. Excuse me. And this map here shows you some of those, what we have been find in the archaeological record. You see the name of the plants here. Some of them are trees, others are shrubs like tobacco, but these areas here that you see in the map are the likely centers of early cultivation or domestication of those plants. And the colors of the dots here correspond to the time, to the age of these plants as they show in the archaeological record. We see that there's a Pan-Amazonian record of plants preservation, and some of this map is a little bit outdated because now we do have cacao, for instance, evidence of cacao cultivation in Ecuador going back to 5,200 years ago, also in the Amazon basin. But look, some of them are palms, Astrocarium, Atalea, Theobroma, which is cacao, Enocarpus is a palm as well, Euterpe precatória, which is the açaí palm, one of the açaí species, and Bertholletia excelsa, which is a Brazil nut. So those plants, the remains of the seeds of those plants are recorded preserved in the archaeological record of the Amazon. And again, if you look at the list, I mentioned the 227, hyperdominant species, and I mentioned that most of them are palms. But if you look at, the whole roster of the 227 species, you're going to find other trees which are also hyperdominant and very important by traditional societies, indigenous people like Theobroma cacao, like Ingá, like Caimito, and again, the Brazil nuts. So it's not only, if you think about hyperdominance, it's not only the palm species, but also other tree species as well. So that's one thing. The other thing which I think is important, I'm going to try to develop these ideas during this presentation here, is that we know today that the Amazon is a center of what we call agrobiodiversity. Many important crops were first cultivated in the Amazon basin. This paper here is from 2006, this map. But if you look at the map, I mean, there's like very well-known centers in China, in the Levant here, in the Near East, in Mesoamerica, in Mexico. But also, if you look at the list, plants such as the peanuts, manioc, and chili peppers were first cultivated in the Amazon. I mean, there are many maps that have been published in the last years that also, they tend to record, to show, to demonstrate how the Amazon was indeed one of the independent centers of plant cultivation across the world. This map here is in Portuguese. I'm sorry for those who are not familiar, and I don't have the scientific names of the plants here. But if you look at this map here of the Amazon basin, you're going to see the Guaraná, Paulina cupana, the cupuaçu, which is a Theobroma grandiflora, the Brazil nut. We have manioc, which is a shrub, not a tree, Oderingá, cacao, which is Theobroma cacao. If you look at the list of those plants here, we're going to see that the ancient Amazonian agroforestry systems, I'm going to use this term during my presentation, they're based on the cultivation of tree crops and also of tubers. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this as well in mind. So it's different from other ancient agricultural systems, for instance, in the Near East, where the cultivation of seed plants was very important, like cereals, annuals. We're talking about here plants with a long cycle, like a Brazil nut can live for hundreds of years, and even the tubers that we see in the gardens, they have they don't have to be harvested in every season. They can be stored on the ground and harvested as there's a need for the consumption of those plants. I think that's another map again, just presenting some of those plants and their the supposed age of their early cultivation in the Amazon and also in other places in the Neotropics. So, I mean, just to sum up this first part of the presentation, what we know today is that almost 70% of the cultivated plants in the Amazon are trees or long-living shrubs. That's an important thing. And so French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, back in 1948, he already noticed this. And he wrote a very interesting quote at the opening of an article where he says that it's not always easy to distinguish between wild and cultivated plants in South America. And there are many intermediate stages between the utilization of plants in their wild state and their true cultivation. Traditionally, archaeologists will look at this and call these systems as, incipient domestication systems, or like people who are on the stage of doing a fully agricultural transition. I think that we should flip these things upside down, this idea upside down, and to denominate what Lévi-Strauss called intermediate states, actually the permanent stage of connection between people and plants along the millennia in the Amazon. So, and how did this agrobiodiversity evolve then? I mean, that eventually culminated in this hyperdominant pattern that I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. Through diversification and experimentation, using the gardens, the house gardens, as places to play along with seedlings brought from the forest, with tree cultivation, and with, as I mentioned before, with root crop agriculture, combining long cycle or very long cycle plants like trees who can grow for decades or even centuries. And also, again, as I'm repeating here myself, the cultivation of tubers as well. And so people have been calling these things with different names: agroforestry, polyculture, forest management. I think that those different names, they all converge within the same principle, which is what I'm trying to outline very briefly here. This paper, for instance, was published a few years back by Yoshi Maizumi and her group at the Max Planck Institute in Jena. And they talk about, for instance, polycultural agroforestry. But again, if you look at there's a scheme here on the side where they present the authors, a graphic rendition on how this process of forest modification and also soil modification, I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. You can see the dark soils here evolved throughout the millennia. Cool. So let's try to have a look at contemporary practices of gardening and forest management in the Amazon today, and to try to see how they show up in the archaeological record. I've taken this picture 20 years ago, actually, from a small plane flying the central Amazon, and you can see here at the center of the picture the burning of an area for the establishment of a garden. And this is normally how traditional gardens are in the Amazon today. People use them, they fell the trees with metal axes or with chainsaws today, open a small plot into the forest, and grow manioc. This picture is from the 1950s. We have to bear in mind that that's not in the Amazon, it's the Atlantic forest in Brazil, that before the arrival of the Europeans, people were not felling trees with metal axes, they used it in stone axes, and probably the shape of the gardens wasn't as regular as it is today. They're probably more amorphous, more amoeba-like. They're shaped of these gardens immersed into the forested areas. And again, slash and burn agriculture, Sweden agriculture, mostly of manioc. You see here manioc in the background and papayas on the foreground. That picture was taken actually on an archaeological site. And root crop agriculture, and then using processing the manioc into like flour, bread, tucupi, and other products as well. Also, we have evidence as well of cultivation of the fertile floodplains of the Amazon and its major tributaries. You can see here like banana trees and papaya trees. People grow manioc in the garden in these places as well. So there was a combination of uplands, more mobile agriculture, and also cultivation of the floodplains along the Amazon River. And I think I'm going to jump this one here. That's just like the high diversity of cultivars that we see in these places. It's in Portuguese. And if you look today, this is changing very fast, unfortunately. But this is, for instance, a picture of a breakfast that I've taken, 5 years ago in this place in the Eastern Amazon. People still eating, in many places, those plants. You see here manioc in the background. There's the juice of the acai palm, bananas which have been introduced, mangoes also introduced. But here we have the babaçu nut, the Brazil nut, cashew. So the consumption of fruits and also of roots, it's still something which is very widespread in the Amazon today. Another picture during field work, breakfast as well, papayas, sweet potatoes, yams, manioc bread, people, consuming, using, making a high, important, very nutritious use of these plants until today. And if you look at the gardens of some contemporary gardens in the Amazon, this picture I also taken it's on the top of an archaeological site. But if you look at here, you're going to see, it looks like a dirt area. It doesn't look like it's under cultivation, but we have squash here in the foreground. We have a small stand here with onions. We have the murumuru palm in the back, which is also very important in an era of transition with the forest as well. And this place is an archaeological site on this area here being cultivated. It's a dark soil where you see the potsherds on the surface. Again, other example of house gardens, intensive cultivation of those like small, like peppers, spices and things like that in the places around the houses. But in the background, in the same place, we see a young stand of Brazil nuts, which is growing on the top of an old pasture in the same place. So it's an interesting combination: long-term cultivation of Brazil nuts in the background, and a more intensive cultivation of things like maize and squashes and house garden cultivation around the residential areas. This is, for instance, a Brazil nut. I've taken this picture in the central Amazon, and this tree is estimated to be more than 500 years old. So once a plot like that is planted, and normally, here it is in an old pasture, but some of them are within the garden. It can last for hundreds of years. So it's an interesting combination, I'm trying to say here, between the dimension of the houses, of the cultivation around the houses, of the gardens, but also tree crop cultivation in forested areas. Another example of this. And if you look at this is a Brazil nut tapper here on the left in front of a Brazil nut tree. But here on the right, you're going to see, this is a young Brazil nut. I don't know if you can see my pointer here. This is a young Brazil nut, which is being grown together with the bacaba palm. So we see the use of fire to do management for the cultivation of two tree species, which are not, technically speaking, domesticated. So it's a management of wild species under this secondary forest or succession plots. I'm going to jump because I love to take pictures, as I mentioned before, like, a gourd tree in the backyard of the garden. We see anato, we see cashew. I mean, I have a small, farm here outside of São Paulo in the Atlantic forest, and the amount of anato trees that I have in my plot, it's amazing. It wasn't planted. We use them for cooking, but it's just like grows up naturally around the residential areas. Other examples of house gardens, that's in the central Amazon. You see there's a house here, and everything that you see around this house has been planted. You can see a cashew nut tree here in front. In the back of it, we have a cacao grove planted by this fellow here, who's the owner. And that, again, it's on the top of an archaeological site. That's the ceramics that you find in this very same place. Other house gardens, that's in the southwestern Amazon, people using old buckets and old canoes to grow things next to their houses. I mean, Donald Lathrop, who was an archaeologist who taught at the University of Illinois, and he's been dead for many years now, he proposed a very interesting concept for Amazonian archaeology, which is the idea of the house garden. And the house garden for Lathrop would be the place where people would bring seedlings from the forest, for instance, around their houses to play, to cultivate them, and to play with them to see their visibility to being consumed by people in the past. We see these things happening today in the Amazon, and I suspect that we have some evidence that this pattern has been going on for at least 6,000 years into the past. Just 1 second here. Another interesting example that we do have in terms of transformation of nature and cultivation is the production of anthropic soils that we call terras pretas in Portuguese. This map here shows you the location. And again, this map is a little bit outdated. It's from 2021. We have more data today. But the spots, the red spots that you see here are places where those anthropic dark soils or anthropogenic soils have been found in the Amazon. We believe that they cover this, the total area covers between 2 and 3% of the Amazon basin. And again, this is an archaeological excavation of one of those soils in southwestern Amazon. I've taken this picture like 2 years ago. And you can see here, there's a very thick strata. It's the ceramics here on the top. And then there's a very thick strata, dark, of those dark soils, which is, again, terras pretas in Portuguese. You can see ceramics here on the bottom. This deposit, we have radiocarbon dated it, goes back to at least 2,700 years ago. And these soils are very important because people look at another example, lots of, they're normally associated to archaeological sites. You can see the potsherds here, like dozens of potsherds. And again, you can see it probably better here. That's the natural soil that we see in many places. This is in the central Amazon, and this is the dark anthropic soils. We know that the soils have been produced by indigenous people starting around 5,500 years ago and becoming more important, more widespread, starting around 2,500 years ago. And they're so important today that people look at the soils to cultivate. This is a papaya farm in the central Amazon that it's, on the top of this place, this picture here, this profile was taken at this place here. This is like a 19-hectare wide papaya plantation on the top of an anthropic dark soils. And these soils are important because they're very fertile and they're very stable. They don't lose their fertility over the millennia. So we see, again, indigenous intervention in the past, not only creating, transforming forests, but also producing soils which are economically important for people who live in the Amazon today. For instance, these are my friends, the Tenharim indigenous people from the southern rim of the Amazon. They live in a threatened territory in the southern Amazon, and they grow maize, in their gardens. Maize is a very important plant for them. And you can see, and they say, as long as we can keep on planting maize, we're going to survive as an autonomous society. And the only places where they can grow maize in their territory are the places where we find those anthropic soils, which are not made by them, which were made by other indigenous people in the past. You can look at the size of those plants. of the maize plants by really evaluating the fertility of those anthropic soils. And how were the soils formed? I think at least, that there was like probably through composting, people burning their garbage in the backyard of their houses, throwing their garbage, digging pits to throw like fish bones and other, food remains like seeds, and small scale burning of like into lower temperature to produce charcoal. The combination of these factors, adding also ceramic shards, this matrix of elements, the mixing of them was probably important into promoting those anthropic changes in the soils that we find today across the Amazon. Okay, so that's, again, in a very rough way, a previous background. What's the other archaeological evidence that we have to back up this kind of information? I mean, we've been finding in the last 30 years that the Amazon was much more densely occupied in the past than people used to believe. This paper was published 2 years ago in Science, and the authors, Vinicius Peripato and his colleagues, they talk about using LiDAR technology. I'm going to be mentioning this in a moment here. There may be more than 10,000 pre-Columbian earthworks are still hidden throughout the Amazon. And how are these earthworks? For instance, this picture here was taken in Acre State here in Brazil, near the border with Bolivia, southwestern Amazon. This place was covered by pasture until the 1970s. Covered by forest. But the removal of the forest and the planting of pasture we see today, can you see the structure here, the horseshoe-shaped structure? These are earthen mounds connected by roads, artificial roads made by indigenous people in the past. In this case here, dating to around 1,000 years ago. Other examples, square structures with moats and also linear roads. We've been excavating some of those sites, and we've been mapping some of those roads. If you look at the right here, you're going to see each letter here corresponds to one different archaeological site. These are ring villages with the mounds around central plazas. And you can see here the lines. These are the linear roads coming out of those mounds. So we've been mapping them. We're finding dozens of structures like that in places today which are not covered by forest, but used to be covered by forest until 40 years ago. Another example, courtesy of Rob Walker from University of Missouri. You can see this. These are cattle here, the white dots that you see here. These are cattle. And if you look at the lines here, like very long linear roads, you can see the geoglyphs, the structures here. And again, this place was covered by forest until a few years back. My colleague, Jennifer Watling, did a very interesting work in this area. She did what we call off-site archaeology. She excavated places not inside the archaeological sites, but away from the archaeological sites. And she was looking for proxies for forest cover during the time of the occupation of those sites. And she found out an interesting pattern. I mean, the natural vegetation there today is there's a high predominance of bamboo covered forest, as you can see here at the bottom. But she found out that during the occupation of the sites, there was a tendency of replacing partially the tree cover of bamboo forest into a cover of palm forest, as you can see here. So there was a replacement of one kind of forest by another kind of forest. And this kind of evidence backs up this idea that indigenous people exerted an important role into transforming forests in the Amazon and creating landscapes that still endure somehow today. Again, I'm just heading towards the end of my presentation here. What's happening in the Amazon today? And I reckon most of you are aware of it, so I'm kind of preaching to the converted here. But I mean, the Amazon lost, this is from 2021, so unfortunately this number here, it's worse today than it was 4 years ago. But the Amazon lost almost 10% of its forest cover in the last 40 years. If you look at this map here, you're going to see everything that you see in yellow here, in this part here, in the southern rim of the Amazon, are places where the forest has been destroyed. And most of the remaining areas that we have of forest in this part of the Amazon, in the southern rim of the Amazon, are either indigenous lands. You can see here the Xingu National Park, National Indigenous Park here, or protected areas. So in a way, we can say that not only indigenous people have helped to create the Amazon that we know today, but actually they are the indigenous people in the Amazon They are the ones who are the gatekeepers preventing the further destruction of these areas, attacked by deforestation in the Amazon. For instance, I mean, that's and now we have climatic change as well. That's the upper Amazon, the Solimões River near Tefé, in a normal picture, not even in the rainy season. And that's the same place last year in the dry season. That's the Amazon River. That's the Madeira River near Porto Velho here in Brazil. That's the largest tributary of the Amazon. And this is the Madeira River last year. We're losing. I mean, the climatic change, deforestation is having a very dramatic effect in the forests of the Amazon, as you know, and in the livelihoods of the people, indigenous people there today. That's an interesting study just published last year here in Brazil that says that the area occupied, the forested areas occupied by indigenous people in the Amazon, in a way, irrigate a large part of Brazil. It's kind of ironic that the agribusiness that is actually destroying parts of the Amazon benefits from the forests that have been, they are still protected and also have been partially created by indigenous people in the past. It's in Portuguese here, but I hope, again, I couldn't find an English version, but I mean, that's the pattern here. You can see the darker here, the stronger the rainfall. And that the evidence shows that this rainfall here, this stronger pattern of rainfall results from, let me go back here, from the clouds that go to the forest, what they call the flying rivers, and a lot of them over indigenous lands. So we see an interesting combination as well. And that's why I'm getting towards the end of my talk. We've been doing this project called Amazon Revealed, or Amazônia Revelada in Portuguese. We're using LiDAR data, and maybe most of you are familiar, but LiDAR is a technology that allows one to find structures which are under the forest cover. That's in the Maya area here, just for you to have an idea. That's the what one normally see above the tree canopy, but that's, through LiDAR, one can see all these beautiful structures under forest cover. So we're mapping sites in this area along the deforestation arc of the Amazon, all the way from Acre to Pará to Marajó Islands. These are like roughly these areas that you see here. The squares are the areas where we have been doing the mapping, and we're finding, so that's these are the general areas, and these are actually the local surveys. And the results are very interesting. We've been finding under the forest canopy, plenty of evidence of archaeological sites. For instance, that's an area, you can see the scale bar here. That's in southern Amazonas state in Brazil. Forest cover, that's actually this area here. And then you can see the structure, the earthen structure on the bottom of it, which is actually the size of Maracanã Stadium here in Rio de Janeiro. So this, I'm not comparing, it's not the same scale of intervention, but these are very large areas covered by archaeological sites. Other places, these are areas covered by forests. And again, the scale bar, and you can see parts of the roads, and also the archaeological sites, moats, ditches, and things like that. Another 4-kilometer scale bar, can you see here? Possible structures, and then you find the structure, you see like the roads, part of the roads connecting them. So these areas which are covered by forest today, we can see, maybe we could treat those places, and again, I'm not a forester, as almost like secondary forests, because there's good evidence that these places have been directly or indirectly transformed by indigenous people in the past. Another example that's near the border with Bolivia, the Guaporé River. Again, moats, like, those ring structures. This is a contemporary road. But everything that you see here is ancient, created by indigenous people in the past, including a Portuguese historical fortress from the 18th century. So this might be the one before the last slide here. So what we're trying to do in this project, Amazônia Revelada, this is a meeting that we had in Manaus last year. We're doing the LiDAR in these threatened areas. We want to register the archaeological sites, and according to Brazilian legislation, we can use this to enhance the protection of these areas, because these places can become historical protected areas. But we're talking with the people who live in these places beforehand. We're not just flying the airplanes and getting the data. Before doing the flights, we went to the field and we asked the people their permits to do the flights. And also we got suggestions of places that could be interesting to do the flights, and the results have been very interesting. Last year, we met in the city of Manaus in October, and we brought people who live on those territories. We had more than 90 people there to discuss the results of it. That's the final day of the meeting, people who were there. And what we want to do, we're still like, we want to fly in new areas. We're looking for funds to do it at this moment. But the idea here is to use, the knowledge that those places have been created, partially at least by indigenous people, having the archaeological evidence as a way to devise and to think of better and more interesting ways to protect those threatened territories. Thank you very much.
Eduardo, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. Terrific presentation. And we already have quite a few questions. We're going to turn now to the audience questions. And just as an advance heads up, if we don't get to your question, we apologize, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. So the first is maybe more of a comment, Eduardo, and that is there's a lot of interest in the papers and the maps that you've put up. And there's questions about folks getting the citations for the papers that you're quoting. And just to let the audience know, we are going to put your slide presentation up early next week. And maybe if there are some places where citations are not complete, just whatever you can do, Eduardo, to help people find their way to the papers, I think that would be really appreciated.
Oh, yes, I'll do it. I think most of them I have the references, but the ones where the references are not there, it's either unpublished stuff, things that we haven't published yet, but yeah, I'll do it. I'll be happy to do it.
That makes sense. Yeah, there's lots of interest. I think people want to really dig in, so that's great. So we have a question from one of our audience members who is wondering if there are any analogous research or evidence of cultivated species and their effects on ecosystems for the neighboring Cerrado or Atlantic forest ecosystems.
Not at the same scale. It's in a way, it's almost like a contradiction because the Cerrado and the Atlantic forest areas are closer to the maybe the larger universities in Brazil, but we don't. And I think the person who asked this question is familiar to the Brazilian biomes, but I really suspect, I'm talking about the Amazon, but I think in the other forest biomes, the Caatinga, the Cerrado, the Atlantic forest, if we dig in literally, we're going to find the same kind of evidence. I mean, I think there's potential data already that points to this. We have some data about the Araucaria management in the Atlantic forest. There's an increase in pollen frequency of the proxy for Araucaria around 1,000 years ago, and it correlates to an increase in a kind of archaeological site pit houses that we find in this area. So I think, I suspect that, although there's nothing much done for these areas, I suspect that if we do it, we're going to find the same kind of correlation as well.
Great. Okay, another question is the audience member writes, usually there are a couple of carbohydrate-based crops, rice in South Asia, corn in Central America, potatoes in the Andes. What was the base food crop in the Amazon?
That's a good question. We used to think that it was manioc. We just because manioc is so important today, and manioc has been cultivated for thousands of years. And I'm not saying that manioc it's no longer important, but as we begin to have access to proxies like phytoliths, starch grains that we can extract from the griddles and from the stone artifacts, we begin to see that there's a much larger amount of plants together with manioc, other root crops like sweet potato, like yams, which, Jos Korea, which was also very important. So, I mean, manioc is important, but I think, there was just a paper published last week based on isotopic data. I mean, maize probably became very important later on, but I think we're really talking about like diversified polycultural systems, characterized by a multitude of root crops together with manioc, providing for the starch for the diet of these people. Again, if not replying well, please let me know, Tony. I'll be happy to.
No, I think that sounds great. And you said there was a paper published last week?
There was a paper, last week. Actually, 2 papers published last week. One in Nature, and the other one, I think, in Nature Ecology and Evolution. I mean, the one in Nature, I'm a co-author. In the Bolivian Amazon, I don't have the time to mention this, but we have stronger evidence for centralized political structures. There were pyramids being built there around 1500 years ago. Maize was very important in the beginning. The isotopes in the collagen in the bones of the burials tell a diet based on maize, and also we have evidence of maize cultivation and around those living areas. So, but again, I think the point here, I don't think there was one single food system in the ancient Amazonian past. We're talking about, that's why diversity, I think, is a good way to, if you look at the whole Amazon, which is very large, we're going to find different economic strategies in terms of food production.
Thank you. All right. We have a question about the pre-colonial estimates of the indigenous populations in the Amazon. Do we have those estimates? And if so, where were the centers of such populations? And related, this is a multi-part question. It would seem Amazon populations were concentrated along rivers and waters as the basis for transportation and cultivation, and as such, the terra firma forests were much less important as compared to Verzea or floodplain forests.
Thank you. I mean, that's a good question because I forgot to mention this. I mean, we do have, the most recent estimates that we have for the population size of the Amazon were published in 2015 and 2018. And they range from 8 to 10 million people in what we call the Greater Amazon, not only the Amazon Basin, but also the Orinoco Basin to the north and the Guianas. So 8 to 10 million is a figure that we use based on the estimates and the archaeological data and things like that. What's interesting, though, is that we used to, for many years, and I worked under this assumption for many years as well, is that the larger settlements will be close to the larger water bodies. But as this roads network that I mentioned to you, I showed the images of the linear roads, those places are very far away from large rivers. We're talking about upland basins. So we are acquiring more data now today that shows that areas away, against the accepted wisdom that we used to have, that only riverine areas will be densely occupied. We're finding evidence of, I think that we can say dense occupation in areas away from the large rivers. And that's why it's so interesting to do archaeology in the Amazon today, because it really the actual data that we're finding in a way challenges the assumptions that we had beforehand. So I think that we cannot assume this anymore. I think, places, away from the large rivers were also densely occupied. We have to understand how people make their livings, and that's an important question. But the evidence has been pointing towards this in the last years.
Thank you, Eduardo. Okay, we have a question from Thomas, and he says that it's a fascinating presentation. He thanks you, and then he says, there is an excellent book on a similar usage of the landscape in California called Tending the Wild. But his question is, what are the implications of this historical usage on the conservation of this essential forest?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Thanks for the suggestion. I think the consequences are very important because for many years, it's still happening here in Brazil. I mean, some of my colleagues, some of my friends that work with conservation biology, there was a very strong assumption that once protected areas are created, local populations have to be expelled from them. And that really generated some tragedies here in Brazil, because I've seen this happening. These people, they've been living there for generations, and then they move into the outskirts. They move into favelas in the large cities, and all that fantastic knowledge that people have about the forest, about life in those places is totally lost. So I think it's an important thing for us. I'm a social scientist. I think there should be no contradiction between the protection of areas and the occupation of those areas by traditional societies. That's why I try to show the slides at the end about the role of indigenous lands into actually promoting rainfall in the Amazon, but also away from the Amazon, and the role that these people, the role that they have today as gatekeepers of areas which are under threat in the Amazon. I think there should be no contradiction, and it's changing here in Brazil, and I see most people are adopting this perspective today. So I don't want to create a straw man. I think 10 years ago, this will be a much more serious issue than it is today. But I think, again, we should come out. And I really think archaeology, although we're talking about the past, there was a paper, there was interesting, today at The Guardian newspaper in the UK, there was a big thing about the guardian cities of the Amazon. And I have a quote in this article. And I say in this quote, listen, archaeology is not only about the past, it's about the future in many ways. because of course we don't have to live as people lived like 4,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. But there are some important lessons to be learned, which is this idea to cultivate, trees and cultivate nature in an open way. And that's the lesson. So I think, the implications, I'm speaking very fast because of time here, but I think the implications are important for the protection and conservation of those areas today, very much so.
And that has been a shift in thinking, right?
Yes, I see in my colleagues, my biology friends, and and I really see this like 15 years ago. There was even a debate in terms of publications, and our work was very criticized because people were very worried. They said, listen, if you guys are saying that it's okay to have 10 million people in the Amazon, that's going to be used as a justification for cattle ranching, soybean farming today. But that's a totally different strategy. So I think people had a reason to be concerned. Because one has to calibrate and elaborate better the argument, but I don't see this much as an issue. Although it still happens here in São Paulo, there's a protected area where people want to expel families that have been living there for several generations. It's what they call estação ecológica. It's a protected area where the state wants to expel these people, and they've been fighting against the state to keep them living there. And that's ironic, Tanya, because we have shell mounds in this place that date back to 8,000 years. So there's people living in this area. It's not like pure nature. It's been modified by traditional societies over the millennia. And I think, again, there shouldn't be a contradiction, I think, into this protecting these areas and acknowledging the presence of traditional societies.
Thank you. We have a question from Mario, and he asks how the rubber boom in the 19th century impacted the composition of cultivated plants in the Amazonian rainforest.
What we think, Mario, is that there's one thing. I have a colleague called André Tunis. He's an ecologist here in Brazil.